Welcome to this episode of Unraveling Adoption, an intentional space to delve into adoption's complexities together. I'm Beth Syverson. I'm an adoptive mom of a vibrant and insightful 20-year-old son, Joe, who is struggling to find his path. I'm walking beside him while working on my own personal growth and healing. I'm also a certified coach now, helping primarily adoptive parents. Joe and I are committed to helping anyone touched by adoption, and we want to help the general public understand adoption's complexities better too. Today's guest is Ben Kuhlman, a 23-year-old adoptee who's currently a philosophy grad student at Boston College. He grew up with a same-race domestic adoptive family, and he was in an open adoption from the beginning. I heard him speak at a recent retreat I attended with CUB, Concerned United Birth Parents. I realized that since open adoption is a relatively recent phenomenon, popular since about the mid-1990s, that today's young adult adoptees are the ones who can tell us how open adoption worked for them. Many of the adoptees I bring on the show are older and therefore have not experienced much openness, if any, in their adoption. So I'm glad to have you on Unraveling Adoption, Ben. We're all ears. Welcome.
Thank you.
First, why don't you let us know about your origin story? How old were you when you were adopted? All that basic stuff.
Sure, yeah. I was adopted pretty much as soon as I was born. There was a little buffer of indecision in between, but mostly my biological parents had selected my adoptive parents prior to my birth.
Okay.
And so in a way it was all set up. My adoptive parents had already adopted once before, like 2.5 years before I was adopted. And so my biological parents were not together at the time of my birth, even though they stayed in each other's lives. Their relationship had ended. I mean, that's the basics of my origin story.
Okay. And the indecision part, was that your birth mother or somebody else's indecision?
Birth mothers.
Yeah.
That's right. She talks about that in her book.
Yes. Would you like to let people know who your birth mother is?
Yeah. So my birth mother is Amy Seek. She has a book called God and Jetfire. She wrote about her experiences, roughly reflecting on her experiences during pregnancy, after, up until the time as maybe 10, 11, or 12, something to, maybe a little bit later, actually. But I think I forget exactly when the book came out. But
okay. Did your adoptive parents take you home from the hospital, or was it a couple weeks? Or
yeah, it was a couple weeks. I think the number I have in my head, obviously I don't remember, but I think it was a month or two. It was
okay. And so since your birth parents chose your adoptive parents and had it all set up ahead of time, it was an open adoption right from the beginning, right? That was always the intention. That is kind of the new way of doing things, it seems like. That's kind of more the accepted norm now, and kind of offered to birth parents as, oh, but look, you'll stay in your child's life. It will be just like nothing happened, or not quite like nothing happened, but like this allure of staying connected. And I wondered how that has felt for you. Did you know that you were in an open adoption and that was unusual? Or, I mean, how do you know when you're a little kid?
Yeah, it is interesting because, when you are a little kid, you accept everything you experience as the norm. And so I talk about sometimes, for example, that I can recall this naive notion that everyone gets adopted and that birth mothers are the people that work at, I can remember imagining like my birth mom working at like a baby store where babies are like produced, and then you go in and like pick a baby or something. Like that's sort of like what I imagined. And that was just like normal. I was like, oh, that's cool. Like, and she gets to visit me and like see how her product is, whatever. But it was like totally cool because it was also like the same dynamic I would have with like a cool aunt or something. So she visited, multiple times a year all through my whole life. So I don't know if I've gone more than 6 or 8 months without seeing her.
All the way from when you were really little. It's so interesting, that story about the baby store, because a lot of adoptees talk about being commodified, but you're saying it wasn't a negative connotation for you. It's just like, well, that's what some of the moms do. And so it's just like a fact, because your older sibling was also in an open adoption. So you saw that modeled for you with another child. And then how old were you when you realized, oh, some people just are born and stay with their family?
Yeah, sorry, I have to actually clarify that. So while my other siblings were also in open adoptions, my biological parents visited most frequently.
Oh. Okay.
And these things fluctuate. In my case, it was more consistent. But for my sister and brother, they actually have contact now. But in terms of visits, it was much more infrequent.
Okay.
And there's, for my younger brother, a period of very little to no contact, I think. And so it's interesting because I also have the experience of, as I mature, and I mean like through adolescence too, like realizing, okay, wait, I have, especially as I became more of my own self and the visits with my biological parents, which would have been earlier on shared with my siblings to a great degree, because we're all just playing together, playing softball in the yard, or like whatever it is. It could be a collective experience. But when you're 13, 14, 15, 16, we're just going on walks together, just me and my biological mom or biological father. And so that's not shared with my siblings. So that's when I started to notice, like, okay, wait, so not everybody has this experience that I have necessarily.
Without telling your siblings' story, were their birth parents just not as available, or was there more conflict, or do you know why you had access more to your birth parents?
Yeah, I think one thing that plays a factor is that, like, biologically I'm an only child. And so neither of my biological parents had another kid.
Okay.
Whereas that's not true in either case for my two original adoptive siblings.
So they were more free to be able to travel and to spend a weekend with you because they didn't have soccer games with the other kids or whatever.
Right.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Wow, that's really fascinating growing up like that. It sort of is boggling my mind how that must be to grow up with 4 parents trying to navigate all of that. And tell me, from your kids' perspective, how were your birth parents and your adoptive parents the same, and how were they different? Was there a huge contrast, or was it like, oh, well, they look a little different, but they're pretty much the same?
Yeah, from my child's eye, I guess they were like pretty similar.
Okay.
All of them like thinkers and writers to some extent. My biological father might be writing about architecture. My biological mother might be writing about adoption.
Okay.
Both my adoptive parents are college professors, and so they're writing about theology. They definitely registered when I was a kid as pretty similar kinds of people.
Okay, so all kind of academic types, intellectual.
Right, and if not academic, at least like very thoughtful.
Readers and writers.
Maybe that's the common denominator.
Okay, wow, okay, good. So you had no choice, and now you're a philosophy major, and you were doomed, so.
Precisely.
Okay, but you said when you were a kid, they seemed more similar. Now, as you are growing into adulthood, is it more stark, the differences, or?
Yeah, I would say that it feels like 2 whole different worlds.
Okay.
Now, being with one or the other.
And when you spend time with your birth parents, are they together, or are you spending time with each one separately?
Yeah, separately.
It's always been separately? Because you said they broke up before you were born. Right. So, okay, so you kind of had 3 different families, right?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so 4 parents, but 3 kind of entities. So how are they different? What's the contrast?
Obviously, there's a lot of things that distinguish them. One thing I can point to is like, a difference between my biological father and my adoptive father, for example, is my biological father is like a lot more hands-on. He's kind of got one foot in academics as an architect and one foot in building as an architect. And so, one of the ways that we bond and spend time is we go and build stuff together. And that's a very different way of relating to each other than one of the primary ways I bond with my adoptive father, talking about philosophy.
Okay.
And those are kind of 2 different realms of experience. And they play board games with my biological father, but not my adoptive father. Okay. Like it's, there's like these, maybe I like the word sensibilities because they're all good people in my opinion. So it's like to talk about the differences and, I mean, as an adoptee that has some like subconscious anger about adoption or something, I have to be careful sometimes not to be like, well, this person gets it and this person doesn't.
Okay,
or, like as like because in a way that's the first difference that registers or whatever. It's like
you feel like your birth parents get the adoption piece more. Is that what you're saying?
I mean, that's another interesting split where I feel like I talk the most about adoption with my biological mother and my adoptive father. So it's it's interesting how those like diagonal.
Wow, that's a lot to navigate, I have to say. My son has divorced parents and a stepmom, but gosh, you got 4 different people that are all your parents, and that's that must just be really tricky to navigate sometimes. What are some of the challenges that you're having in maybe now or maybe when you were a kid of kind of managing all those relationships?
Mm-hmm. I would say when I was a kid, it was easy because it was managed for me.
Okay.
I remember, being 18, like a few months before I was like getting ready, applying to college and all of that. And just a piece of advice I got from my adoptive father was that, as you move into adulthood, you, come to be sort of in not necessarily control, but you're responsible for the relationships you have. And this wasn't directed precisely at my relationship with my biological parents, but it was just him reminding me that I kind of decide how much I see who. And maybe I took that and ran with it in a way, because it was after that I started, there was other events coinciding. Like when I was 18, the high school graduation is also when I, had a more intentional conversation for the first time with my biological mother about what our relationship was.
Okay.
And so all through college, I've been, kind of bouncing between these places and like trying to, it's really brought kind of front and center when there's like a holiday or something. Like people talk about this because it's like, so this Thanksgiving was the first time I spent it with my biological father, which is kind of interesting.
Okay.
And it's just, these things are, I didn't tell my adopted mother until the day before, which was, well, because I, in a way it was like she had a weekend travel and I had a weekend travel.
Okay.
So I had told my adoptive father, but to some extent we were just not in the same place. But I noticed in retrospect, I was kind of like waiting for her to sort of tell me like, okay, this is what's going to happen on Thanksgiving. And then I would say, oh, actually, I'm going to do this instead or something. But since that didn't happen, I think we just missed each other. But that's interesting because it was like, was I resistant to that? Did I not want to go out of my way to initiate conversation about, well, this is what what I want to do? And
that's complicated because every holiday you got 3 different places to go, and then you got 2 people to disappoint or 2 entities to disappoint, right? It can't be.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. How do you do that? And are they geographically, how far away is everybody?
Say everyone's within a 4-hour drive of each other.
Okay.
Or maybe 4 or 5.
Not terrible, but that's still not just like down the street. Okay.
Right. It is a little bit like my biological mother, for example, is in New York, and that's where it's easy to frequent there because there's always a reason to go to New York.
Sure.
But that's like a 3.5-hour train ride. And I had actually, maybe this is interesting in the context of a current question, that I had actually planned my academic schedule such that I could spend effectively like Monday to Thursday with my adoptive family in Rhode Island and spend Thursday evening to Monday morning in New York with staying with my biological mother. I organized my classes so that would work, but it ended up being so like unrealistic. But like I always feel myself trying to integrate this more, make it more, like I could have, for example, I'm living with my adoptive parents at this moment while I'm at grad school in Boston. So it's in a car, it's a 1-hour commute. When I have to take the train and my bike, it's a 3-hour door-to-door commute. So it's actually pretty inconvenient. But yeah, there was this thinking before the semester about how can I be like closer to everybody in Providence, where I live with my adoptive family is kind of in between Boston and New York. And it was just sort of like, that was sort of that's where I belong. And it's like in between these two people, or like, that just makes it easier.
Yeah. There's a lot of in between. That's kind of your life has been in between, just trying to balance that all. And that must be really hard for a young adult. You're trying to just balance your own self, but you're also trying to, are you like a people pleaser type that's like, I want to make sure everybody's okay and check in with everybody? Is that part of your personality?
Yeah, I mean, I think I fluctuate between being like really disagreeable and my way or the highway.
Okay.
And also being like really thinking of others.
Okay.
Every summer I set aside a month for each of my biological parents. Wow. And with my biological father, we go into the woods and we build. Like I don't get to see my friends for a month. I probably could like organize, but you know what I mean? Like that's
intense. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It's not without sacrifice.
You like build like log cabins or something, right? Or houses or?
Yeah, not log cabin per se, but yeah, we're using like some local wood.
Like from scratch.
Yeah. I mean, from the ground up, we'll typically have like a foundation poured in cement and then build it up.
And the 2 of you build a house.
We've built 2 now.
That's some skills.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's dedication right there. And to be able to live with someone for a month and work together for such an intense time, that must I mean, you must really like him in order to do that, or like building. I'm not sure which, but yeah, that's a pretty intense experience. Although I have heard you say that you don't talk too much when you're building. You just work side by side.
Well, yeah, it's interesting because this is another thing about sensibilities, which I like that word, is he's just like not as much of a talker, feeler. I mean, like he's a deep person. I think he feels and he thinks a lot. And yeah, it's just more of like, that's an uncomfortable kind of thing for us to get into. And so in a way, it's great that we have stuff to build together.
Yeah, gives you something to focus on and work on together. That's really cool. Well, ever since my son turned 18, I'm very aware that he never has to talk to me again, and that anytime any of us as parents, when we have an adult child that wants to be with us, I feel like we should be very honored and grateful, because you don't ever have to. There's nothing that's saying you have to get something from these people ever again. So the fact that you're still in relationship with all of these parents is pretty admirable for all of you involved. I'm sure it's tricky sometimes. Okay, so I want to talk about open adoption, because I know a lot of parents that listen to this are in open adoptions or are trying to be in open adoptions. From the adoptee's point of view, and I know you don't know any other way, but what are the best things about growing up in an open adoption?
Yeah, I would say that, well, naively, it's like I have more parents and younger biological parents who are out being single, adventurous. They're pursuing careers and they're coming to visit and bringing with them things that they're experiencing in the world. Like my biological mom introduced me to skateboarding, graffiti, parkour.
Oh my gosh, that's awesome.
I think even showed me I think she dated a Marine or something, and I learned that you could have a workout program and like all these, things that, I mean, I probably could have encountered in the world too, but and also as a child, it's like these people that have kind of like an intense interest in you and they come and asking you questions, and you really get to explore yourself in a way. At the same time, was that my siblings' experience? I can't say. So it's kind of hard to talk about what's the good and bad of open adoption, because like which open adoption? Like
yeah, it's only your own. I know that is tricky. Everyone's is very different. It sounds like you had as positive an experience as it could be. And as you were talking, I realized that a lot of times, I bet there is that kind of a generational divide, because usually relinquishing parents tend to be younger, but not always. And usually adoptive parents tend to be older, because probably they've tried other ways to make families and then they couldn't for one reason or another. And then how many years are between your adoptive parents and your birth parents?
I'd say it's less. Like 5 to 10 years.
Oh, it's not that big.
Yeah, it's not huge.
But maybe more of they're more free because they were single and...
Maybe it's more than 10 years. Okay. But yeah, no, more free too.
More free, yeah. Okay, that's interesting. Interesting. Okay, and so from your perspective, from your experience, what were some of the disadvantages of being in an open adoption as opposed to a closed adoption, not opposed to not being adopted?
Well, I would say that in a way, sometimes I wonder if, because I had this cognizance of these two people that I was related to, and also as adolescent, you're figuring out what is you and what's not you, and who am I, kind of thing. That kind of synthesized into a question about like, okay, well, which parents am I going to pick? You know what I mean? Yeah. And so sometimes I wonder in retrospect if my relationship with my adoptive parents, for example, would have less complications, or it's just, sometimes I like to think of it like, like we say open adoption. We also have this term like open relationship, or a couple date and see other people. And in a way, like sometimes I wonder like how comparable is it? Because, when you're dating, if you're not focused on one person, then your relationship to anybody is kind of diminished.
Yeah.
And also in the way that I could, in that sort of adolescent tension of who am I, really kind of oppose them to each other.
I was going to ask, did you manipulate them sometimes?
Yeah, well, because in a way, it's like both my biological parents are in architecture and both of my adoptive parents are in theology.
Okay.
So like the theology, philosophy world. And this is like a divide in philosophy. It's like matter versus spirit, or, it's like there's this dualism and this like lots of ways in which naturally I can't imagine it any other way. But yeah, just like maybe as a child seeing them as they're all similar. as an adolescent, seeing them as opposites, and now not really opposing them to each other, but seeing them each as individuals. But yeah, they definitely some opposition.
Oh yeah, I bet. Was there sometimes when you felt like you needed to be more loyal to one or the other in order to maybe, I don't know, make someone happy or get what you want? Do you feel pulled even maybe still with these holidays and that kind of thing? Or are you keeping score? Like, oh, I've spent too many weekends over there. I better, is there any of that involved, or has there been?
I would say, yeah, I mean, to a great extent, I feel very conscious of that. I think as I'm just sort of following my own gut or whatever more and more, and just more secure in myself. And also, an interesting part of that is what's underneath that, sort of people pleasing or balancing is like, well, is somebody going to reject me?
Sure.
Like, am I going to go to visit one person and like not be able to come back? Or like, even though that, even if your relationship is such that, because I think mine is this way with my adoptive parents, with my biological parents, that like kind of feels like nothing I could do would, or nothing I would do would actually make that relationship collapse. But it's interesting that there's still this sort of anxiety about, like, well, what if they don't? And so I think that definitely motivates some kind of like accounting of, okay, what we did, I don't know. Yeah, but I think that while that was a conscious experience and still is a conscious experience, just because like I went to Thanksgiving for the first time with, I'm also like in finals season. I'm like writing so like this is the busiest time of the year for me in a way. So, or the semester.
Yeah.
And so then I'm going to Vermont and it's like, okay, well, how many Thanksgiving have we not had together? And then like, okay, so let's spend some time together. So I'm splitting my time between doing my work and visiting, which was actually a great balance for the weekend. But then I come home and there's some relatives visiting here. And then it's like, okay, well, now I also have to, and then it's like, where's my focus time? Like, where's my, like, well, since I played board games with biological fathers, so I can't say no to playing cards with adoptive father's father. It's like,
yes, I can imagine.
But I actually did say no because
I got to study.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for doing this interview in the middle of your finals. Appreciate that.
No problem.
Maybe you needed a break. I don't know. Well, I can't imagine how much that must be an extra layer that you just probably don't even realize you have to deal with all the time. It's just part of what you've had to do your whole life, but that just adds an extra layer, a couple of layers probably, of navigating and figure out, what do I want in all this? Because I bet you're trying to make sure all these other parents are happy, but what do you want out of all of it? It must be really hard. Assuming that a child has to get adopted, let's just be in that world right now and just assume that there's no one else to take care of this child and they have to be adopted. Would you advocate for openness in adoption or not?
I think I would, based off I don't know to what extent my experience generalizes, but yeah, I mean, I think that it's definitely a complicated thing, no matter how great the conditions are. But it definitely did something for me to have contact with my biological part of the adoptee experience. Like, well, why was I like given up or something? Or like, am I not good? Or like, there's some of that in the background. And having a relationship with my biological parents and hearing about their experiences, their story, and why everything is the way it is. And I think that helps me be able to make sense, just knowing the story. Whereas like in my imagination, the alternative is just like, don't think about it. Or I don't like to what extent the adoption's closed. Yeah, and maybe in a way I think about it like no matter what, there are these maybe at least 3, maybe 4 people in this adoption constellation. I mean, in terms of parents. Yeah, I guess the question of open adoption versus closed is whether or not we let this one person pay attention to these 2 elements of the constellation. And I think if you don't, like if it's closed, if they're out of the picture in some way, they're not going to be totally out of sight, out of mind, because in a way it's part of you or it's part of your story. So maybe that leaves something to be discovered later on. But I'll say on the side of open adoption, it definitely gives you more that you have to integrate to be a full self or to be self-coherent.
Yeah, I bet that's a lot of work. And it sounds like you've done a lot of that. And I'm sure your mom has helped you with that too. The whole nature versus nurture argument, I used to think that nurture was more important, but now I clearly can understand that nature is super important and much more impactful than I had ever imagined. You've been able to kind of have a bird's eye view to all of it. What do you think about the nature versus nurture? How have you turned out? Which has proven to be more strong?
Yeah, that's really interesting because I can feel them pushing against each other sometimes, but in a way I feel like they're in some kind of balance right now where, as I said, both my biological parents are in architecture, and that encompasses a lot about their personalities too. Father's into building, hands-on stuff. My mother's just in love with light and beauty, and I could sort of make sense that those are the sensibilities I'm talking about, whereas my adoptive parents are intellectual, very religious. And I can actually point to some of these experiences where I think maybe if I had to give one answer, it would be that nature is stronger, but also because I'm nurtured by my biological and my adoptive parents. So in a way, it's like they have a certain advantage because my biological parents do have nature and nurture in a way.
That's true. That's different.
Pulling me in.
That's true. Well, it's interesting because you're kind of following the career path of your adoptive parents more. Philosophy and theology are pretty similar, but it sounds like you are pretty well rounded and have kind of taken from all of these four parents of yours. And I think it sounds like an amazing stew, and you're navigating it very, very well. It seems to me, I'm sure it's not always easy, but it seems like you're figuring out who you are and how you fit into all of this. And that's your job right now, I guess, as a young adult.
I agree.
All right. Before we pressed record, we were talking about how my son is often the only 20-ish-year-old person in the room. And that was similar for you at this cub retreat. There's like women my age and older, a few men, and then you were one of the very few kind of young people in your 20s. Do you feel that a lot of adoption spaces that you're in, or maybe you haven't been in that many adoption spaces?
I mean, here and there, like a couple happy hours I've attended, a couple. I mean, there are some individuals that I've connected to from adoption land and kind of keep up with them. And but when at these like retreats, especially, it's like where are the young people? But something that impacts me more is where are usually it's mostly women.
Yes.
Is my experience. And I actually, more than I wonder where are all the young people, I wonder where are all the men.
I know. I agree. And I don't know if anyone's noticed, every other episode is with a man or non-binary person. And it would be super easy for me to just have women on all the time. And I have women knocking on my door. I have just a gigantic list of women, white women especially. So I'm very happy when there's a man that was willing to talk to me. I want my son to be able to hear voices that are like him. It's so important. And I appreciate anytime a man is willing to come and talk about this, because I don't know what that is. Is it just men aren't groomed to be more emotive, or I don't know if it's that kind of thing. I don't know, because I don't think it's that big of disparity as far as how many men or boys get adopted. I don't think there's that big of a difference, is there?
Not that I've heard of.
I don't think so. Maybe only from China. But it's interesting. But man, we need more young men for my son and Ben to hang out with. So I hope maybe someday you'll be able to meet my son. He's pretty cool, and he's a deep thinker as well. And he would probably really enjoy talking to you. So hopefully you guys can meet up someday.
Yeah, I'd love to.
So if people wanted to talk to you directly, are you willing to interact with them, or how could they get a hold of you?
Yeah, I'm totally happy to interact. I suppose that on social media and Instagram, rather, I don't have Twitter. Also, email works.
Okay. Are you easy to find on social? Is it just Ben Kuhlman, or?
Yeah, on social media. I guess I also have Facebook too, just as Ben Kuhlman. On Instagram, I'm at Ben Kuhlman 1.
Okay.
That's the number 1 at the end. And my email is benj.kuhlman@gmail.com.
Okay. I'll put all that in the show notes, so you can go ahead and reach out to Ben. And while you're there, go ahead and reach out to Unraveling Adoption on all those same places. I also am not on Twitter, but I'm on most of the other places. And our website is unravelingadoption.com, where you can find out everything about everything that we do here, including my coaching, our podcast, events, things like that. And we are also on Patreon if you want to help make sure we keep this podcast commercial free. You can support us with as little as $5 a month. It really helps us keep rolling with all the software and materials I need for the podcast. find that at patreon.com/unravelingadoption. And I think that's it. Well, thank you all for listening. I hope you really enjoyed this conversation with Ben. I know I did. And Ben and I want you all to stay safe.